I knew something was wrong before I even stepped into the clearing. It was the silence. Not the peaceful kind you expect in the woods, where birds argue in the trees and water hums over rocks, but a silence that felt deliberate, like it was holding its breath. Toby was beside me, dragging a bundle of damp sticks we'd gathered for the morning fire. The cold mountain air had already started tightening his chest. I could hear it in the shallow rhythm of his breathing. When we pushed past the last line of brush and saw the campsite, my heart stopped. The SUV was gone. My parents' truck was gone. The tents, the folding chairs, the coolers, the bright red duffel that held Toby's primary asthma medication, gone. The patch of grass where they'd been parked lay flattened and empty, as if they had never existed. There was no note taped to a tree, no frantic message scratched in the dirt. Instead, my father's old hunting dagger was driven straight through the wooden picnic table. Under the blade was a folded piece of paper. My hands were already shaking when I pulled it free. Don't come back. For a full 10 seconds, I couldn't breathe. Mom? Toby's voice was small behind me. Where did they go? I forced my lungs to work. I forced my face to stay calm. Panic would spread to him in seconds if I let it. They probably went to get something, I said, though even as the words left my mouth, I knew they were hollow. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the clearing. No spare water containers, no first aid kit, no emergency flare gun, no satellite phone. They hadn't left a single useful thing behind. My phone showed no signal in the top corner. Of course it did. Grace had chosen this campsite herself. She had insisted it was secluded and good for clearing the mind. I dropped to my knees and pulled open Toby's small backpack. My stomach dropped even further. The main medication pouch was missing. The blue zippered bag I had packed myself that morning, the one with his full inhaler and backup steroids, was gone. All that remained was the small emergency inhaler I had slipped into his side pocket 2 weeks earlier without telling anyone. Mom? Toby asked again, his breathing already rougher from the cold. Are we staying here? I swallowed hard. No, we're going on a hike, a long one. As I stood, the first wave of disbelief passed. The second wave wasn't panic, it was calculation. I walked to the edge of the clearing and crouched near the tire tracks. They weren't messy. They weren't rushed. The vehicles had reversed carefully, turned in wide arcs, and driven away without tearing up the ground. No argument, no emergency, deliberate. I looked down at the note again. The handwriting wasn't my father's. It was too sharp, too controlled. It looked like Grace's. A memory surfaced, sharp and unwelcome. 2 weeks before the trip, I had logged into my mortgage portal and seen access timestamps I didn't recognize. Grace had brushed it off as a glitch. 3 months earlier, she had insisted on restructuring my finances after Daniel died. She had asked for digital copies of my signature files from our last refinance. She had even joked over dinner, if something happened to you, the bank couldn't just grab the house overnight. At the time, I thought she meant protection. Now, standing in that empty clearing, I understood something else entirely. I checked Toby's pulse, slightly elevated. His lips were pale from the cold. How many puffs do I have left? He asked quietly. I forced a smile. Enough. But I was already counting. If I rationed carefully, the backup inhaler might last 2 days. Maybe less if the temperature dropped again tonight. I scanned the trees and noticed faint ATV tracks leading deeper into the forest, away from the main access road. They hadn't just left. They had scouted. I folded the note carefully and slipped it into my jacket pocket. Evidence. Every detail mattered now. Toby, I said gently, kneeling in front of him. We're going to follow the creek. Water always leads somewhere. He nodded, trusting me the way children do, without question. As we stepped away from the clearing, I didn't think of myself as a daughter anymore. I thought of myself as the only barrier between my son and the plan they had set in motion. They hadn't just abandoned us in the wilderness, they had calculated how long it would take my son to run out of air. We followed the creek because water meant direction, and direction meant hope. Toby walked beside me, quiet, saving his breath the way I had taught him during bad flare-ups back home. The sound of the current sliding over rocks pulled memories loose, whether I wanted them or not. 8 months earlier, I had been standing in a hospital hallway in Pittsburgh, listening to a doctor explain that my husband's stroke had been massive and instant. Daniel had built a contracting business from nothing, but the market had turned before we realized how deep the losses were. By the time he died, there were loans I didn't know existed and suppliers waiting to be paid. The house in Shadyside was valued at $1.5 million on paper, but paper doesn't breathe. Paper doesn't wake up at night wondering how to make the next mortgage payment. The second lien was brutal. The foreclosure warning arrived within 90 days of Daniel's funeral. I tried to handle the paperwork alone at first. I met with the bank, I requested extensions, I sold what I could, but eventually my parents insisted I let Grace take a look. She had always been the golden daughter, former real estate broker, the one who had once negotiated my parents out of near bankruptcy years ago. Grace came over with the leather portfolio and that confident half-smile she wore like armor. She told me she could restructure the debt, maybe negotiate short-term protection if the market shifted. She asked for access to my mortgage account. She said she needed digital copies of my signature from our last refinance so she could match documents properly. I sent them. A few weeks later, I received an email confirmation for a life insurance travel policy listing both me and Toby as insured parties. $50,000 each. I stared at it longer than I should have. When I asked Grace about it, she laughed lightly. Standard travel coverage for group trips. It's cheap, don't overthink it. But I hadn't agreed to any new policy. I didn't remember signing anything. Late one night, when Grace left her iPad unlocked on my kitchen counter, a notification popped up from an online casino platform. Withdrawal attempts, failed payments. The total due was in the hundreds of thousands. My stomach tightened. I overheard her in the hallway later that evening, whispering sharply into her phone. I'll have the money before summer. I told you. When I mentioned the gambling to my mother, she waved it away. It's temporary. She's just stressed. At dinner the following week, Grace said something that lodged in my mind and refused to leave. If something happened to you, the house wouldn't go straight to the bank, she said, slicing her chicken neatly. There are ways to protect property from immediate foreclosure. My father nodded as if that was reassuring. Now, walking along the cold creek with Toby's breathing growing tighter, that sentence sounded different. The camping trip had been Grace's idea too, a healing getaway in Allegheny National Forest. She insisted she knew the perfect secluded site. She said the mountain air would be good for Toby's lungs. How many inhalers do you usually pack? She had asked casually while helping me load the SUV. 2, I said. Primary and backup. Good, she replied. Always good to be prepared. 2 weeks before we left, I logged into the county property records and saw that someone had accessed my file. The timestamp didn't match my login history. That was the first moment I felt something cold slide down my spine. I didn't confront her. I prepared quietly instead. I slipped a tiny voice recorder into Toby's stuffed bear before we left. I hid an extra inhaler in the side pocket of his small hiking backpack. I printed out my original will naming Toby as sole beneficiary and tucked it into a folder at home. I told myself I was being paranoid. The morning we left for the forest, Grace personally rearranged the back of the SUV. She picked up Toby's red medication duffel and said she would make sure it was secure. My father packed his old hunting dagger, claiming it was for tradition. I didn't notice the medication bag was missing until we stepped back into that empty clearing. Now, as Toby stumbled slightly on the uneven rocks beside the creek, the pieces locked into place. The insurance policy purchased months earlier, the digital signatures, the foreclosure deadline, the campsite chosen for its isolation, Grace handling the medication bag. They hadn't panicked and driven off. They had prepared for our disappearance long before we ever stepped into those woods. The first night without his inhaler was the longest night of my life. We followed the creek downhill for hours, moving slowly, conserving energy. The forest thickened as the afternoon wore on, branches arching overhead like ribs. Toby tried to keep pace, but I could hear the change in his breathing long before he said anything. Short pulls, controlled exhale, the way I had taught him during flare-ups back home. "How are you doing?" I asked. "I'm okay," he said, which meant he wasn't. I stopped and crouched in front of him, keeping my voice steady. "We're going to walk slower now. In through your nose, out through your mouth, like we practiced." He nodded and obeyed. I inventoried what we had while we walked. One backup inhaler, already half used from winter flare-ups, 2 water bottles, my father's dagger, the note folded in my jacket pocket, no food except a crushed granola bar I found at the bottom of Toby's pack. 48 hours. Maybe less if the temperature dropped tonight. Late in the afternoon, I noticed faint tire tracks cutting off from the main access trail and disappearing deeper into the trees. They weren't from rescue vehicles. They were fresh enough that the edges hadn't collapsed. They had driven farther in than necessary. The thought settled into my chest like stone. We walked until the light began to thin. I chose a patch of ground slightly elevated from the creek, shielded by a fallen log. I used the dagger to strip bark and gather dry kindling from inside hollow branches. A small fire flickered to life just as the cold crept in. Toby sat wrapped in my jacket, watching the flames. "Mom," he said quietly, "did they forget my medicine?" I held his gaze. No. The truth felt heavy but clean between us. Night fell fast. The temperature dropped with it. Around midnight, I heard the change in his breathing before he woke me. It started with a soft whistle, then a tighter pull, then the unmistakable high-pitched wheeze that meant his airways were narrowing. I grabbed the inhaler and shook it, praying there was more inside than I thought. I guided the spacer to his mouth. "One slow breath," I whispered. He inhaled, held, released. I counted silently. The wheeze softened but didn't disappear. I used one more measured dose, careful, deliberate. I could feel the canister growing lighter in my hand. After a few minutes, his breathing steadied enough for him to lie back down. But I didn't sleep. I watched his chest rise and fall against the flickering firelight. At dawn, I went searching for more wood and anything edible. That's when I found it. Half buried in damp leaves near a cluster of roots was a small cardboard box. The edges were softened by moisture, but the pharmacy label was still legible. Toby Reynolds. The inhaler canister was gone. The box wasn't torn by weather. It had been opened cleanly, emptied, and discarded. For a moment, I couldn't move. They hadn't just taken the medication bag. They had removed the inhaler itself and thrown away the evidence. I picked up the box carefully and slipped it into my pack. When I returned, Toby was sitting upright, rubbing his chest. "Did you find anything?" he asked. "Something," I said. We ate the last of the granola bar in silence. His energy was fading faster than I wanted to admit. By midday, another flare began to build. Without medication, I had to rely on positioning and calm. I sat him upright, arms braced on his knees, encouraging slow breaths. I heated stones in the fire and poured water over them to create steam under a makeshift tent of fabric. It wasn't medicine. It was delay. As evening approached, I thought I heard something beyond the rush of water. An engine, distant and brief. It started, idled for a few seconds, then cut off. I froze, listening. It wasn't close enough to see, not rescue. I looked at the tree line and felt a new kind of certainty settle inside me. They weren't just waiting for us to disappear. They were close enough to know exactly how long we had left. By the third morning, the inhaler was almost empty. Toby woke up pale, his curls damp against his forehead, his breathing shallow even before he tried to sit up. I pressed my fingers gently to his neck and counted. Too fast, too strained. He tried to smile at me like he always did when he didn't want me to worry. "I'm okay," he whispered. I nodded because he needed me steady more than he needed me honest. I shook the inhaler and pressed it once. The spray came out thin. I waited, then pressed again. The canister sputtered. One more. That was all that came. The click that followed was hollow, final. I shook it again anyway. Nothing. For a moment, the forest felt too big, too indifferent. I slid the empty inhaler into my pocket instead of throwing it away. Every piece mattered now. His breathing tightened again by mid-morning. I remembered something from childhood camping trips with my father, lungwort growing in damp shaded patches near mossy rocks. I had laughed at the name back then. Now I searched desperately along the creek's edge. I found broad leaves speckled pale against green and prayed I wasn't wrong. I gathered what I could and returned to our small fire pit. I heated stones and poured water over them, crushing the leaves into the steam. "Lean forward," I told him softly. He inhaled the damp air slowly. In, hold, out. It helped, but only a little. By late afternoon, the sky shifted from gray to something heavier. The air pressure changed. The forest stilled in that unnatural way it does before a storm. The first crack of thunder rolled across the valley, and Toby flinched. Within minutes, rain began to fall in thick sheets. The creek that had been our guide started to swell, water darkening and rising fast against its banks. "We have to move," I said. The ground turned slick beneath our feet as we climbed toward higher ground. Toby stumbled twice, his breathing uneven, panic creeping in with the cold. "Stay with me," I whispered, wrapping my arm around him. The rain intensified, turning the creek into a rushing wall of brown water. Debris snapped past, branches, broken limbs, leaves spinning in violent circles. A flash flood. I spotted a thick oak tree on slightly higher terrain and dragged us toward it. I stripped fabric from the inside lining of my jacket and twisted it with vines I hacked down with the dagger. I tied Toby to my back first, tight enough to hold but loose enough for him to breathe. Then I looped the makeshift rope around the trunk and fastened us both to it. Water surged past our legs, cold and relentless. The tree shuddered under the force. "Mom, I'm tired," Toby murmured against my shoulder. "I know," I said, pressing my cheek to his hair. "Just hold on." The rain pounded against us for what felt like hours. My fingers went numb. My legs trembled. I kept one hand on his back, counting the rhythm of his breathing in the dark. This was how they thought we would die. Cold, breathless, washed away. When the water finally began to recede, the forest looked rearranged, as if the storm had redrawn the map. As I carefully untied us, something caught my eye downstream, tangled in exposed roots where the flood had stripped away the soil. I waded closer. A fragment of plastic medication bag, torn but recognizable. The pharmacy label was still partially attached, smeared but legible enough to see Toby's name. The edge was cleanly cut, not ripped by current or rock. They hadn't just taken the inhaler. They had opened the bag, removed what they wanted, and discarded the rest. I picked up the plastic carefully and folded it into my pack beside the empty inhaler box. That night was colder than the last. Without medication, Toby's breathing remained fragile. I wrapped him in both of our damp jackets and held him against my chest to share warmth. For the first time, I allowed the words to form clearly in my mind. Grace tried to kill my son. Not by accident, not by neglect, by calculation. At dawn, the sky cleared into a pale blue. The storm had carved new channels into the earth, exposing higher ridges I hadn't noticed before. In the distance, barely visible through thinning mist, I saw a thin line of smoke rising above the trees. I adjusted Toby's weight against my back and tightened the straps I had fashioned from vine. "We're going that way," I told him. If we made it out of these woods, I wouldn't just tell a story about surviving the wilderness. I would prove that someone had planned it. By the 6th day, Toby could barely keep his eyes open. I carried him more than he walked, shifting his weight carefully against my back as we moved toward the faint ribbon of smoke rising in the distance. Each step felt like it traveled through mud, even when the ground was dry. My legs burned. My throat was raw from yelling into empty air the night before. "Mom," he whispered once, his voice thin against my ear. "Are we close?" "Yes," I said, because hope was lighter to carry than truth. The smoke led us to a weathered maintenance cabin tucked into a shallow clearing. The structure leaned slightly to one side, its paint peeled away by years of neglect. The door hung crooked, but it opened. Inside, the air was dry, dusty but dry. There was an old emergency blanket folded on a shelf, a rusted lantern, and a broken two-way radio sitting on a wooden table. On the far wall, faded beneath layers of grime, was a laminated map of Allegheny National Forest trails. I stepped closer to it. We were far deeper than any casual campsite should have been. The marked access roads were miles away. The main ranger station was even farther. Grace hadn't just chosen seclusion. She had chosen distance. I laid Toby down on the floor, wrapped him in the emergency blanket, and checked his breathing. Shallow but steady. His skin was cool to the touch. I picked up the radio and twisted the knob. Static crackled, then faded into silence. I tapped it against my palm. Nothing. I stepped outside and climbed carefully onto the cabin's low roof. The sky was clearer now. I held up the emergency blanket and angled it toward the ridge, catching the sunlight and reflecting it in short bursts. Flash, pause, flash. My arm trembled from exhaustion, but I kept going. An hour passed, then another. Just as my muscles began to give out, I heard it. An engine. Closer this time. I slid down from the roof and ran into the clearing, waving the blanket overhead. My voice tore through my throat as I screamed. 2 men on ATVs emerged between the trees, their orange safety vests bright against the green. They slowed when they saw me. "Over here!" I shouted, my legs nearly buckling. They dismounted quickly, scanning the area before moving toward the cabin. One of them stepped inside and came back out seconds later. "There's a kid in there," he called to his partner. They moved fast. One of them pulled a small oxygen tank from the back of his vehicle. By the time they reached Toby, his breathing had become ragged again, his chest pulling hard with each inhale. The mask went over his face. Oxygen hissed softly. I sank against the wall and let the sound wash over me. We were transported to Erie County Medical Center by late afternoon. Toby was placed on a nebulizer immediately. The steady rhythm of the machine filled the room as medication flowed where it should have days ago. A doctor in his 40s stepped into the hallway with me later. "You're lucky," he said gently. "Another 24 hours without intervention could have gone very differently." Lucky? I nodded because I didn't trust my voice. A sheriff arrived not long after. He introduced himself as Detective Alvarez and asked how long we had been missing. 7 days, I said. His eyebrows lifted slightly. "That's not what your family indicated," he replied. A cold ripple moved through me. "What did they say?" "They filed a missing persons report on day 3, he said. "At the same time, they submitted a preliminary life insurance claim." My hands curled into fists. "They what?" He continued, steady and factual. "They also filed an emergency petition to manage your property, citing concern over foreclosure exposure." I felt the room tilt slightly. On a nurse's phone later that evening, I saw it myself. A social media post from my mother announcing a candlelight vigil. A photograph of Toby smiling at last summer's barbecue. A caption about tragic circumstances and unanswered questions. Grace had posted a tribute as well. Words about heartbreak, about loss, about a hiking accident gone wrong. There was even a flyer scheduled for Sunday. Celebration of life. They were burying us in public while we were still fighting to breathe. Back in Toby's hospital room, I pulled the stuffed bear from my bag and removed the tiny recorder from inside it. My hands were steadier now than they had been in the forest. I pressed play. Grace's voice crackled softly from the speaker. Without the inhaler, he won't last 2 nights. I looked at Detective Alvarez when he returned. I have more than a story, I told him quietly. I have proof. The hospital conference room smelled faintly of disinfectant and stale coffee when I laid everything out on the table. The note from under the dagger, the empty inhaler box, the torn medication bag fragment I had pulled from the flood debris, the printed confirmation email for the travel life insurance policy, and finally, the small digital recorder I had hidden inside Toby's stuffed bear. Detective Alvarez sat across from me, Assistant District Attorney Monroe beside him, legal pad open but untouched. I pressed play. Grace's voice filled the room, thin but unmistakable. Without the inhaler, he won't last 2 nights. No one spoke for several seconds after the recording ended. Monroe leaned back slowly. "How long have you had this?" "Since before the trip," I said. "I put it in his bear 2 weeks earlier." Alvarez's expression changed. The concern that had marked our first conversation hardened into something colder. "This is no longer just abandonment," he said quietly. Monroe began assembling the timeline aloud. Insurance policy purchased 3 months before the camping trip. $50,000 per insured party. My digital signature reused from refinance documents submitted weeks earlier. The policy classified as high-risk travel coverage. Insurance claims submitted on day 3 of our disappearance. Emergency property management petition filed on day 4. No documented request for organized search efforts from them, Alvarez added. They filed paperwork faster than they filed concern. My chest felt tight, but not from fear, from clarity. Monroe slid another document across the table. "We subpoenaed access logs for your mortgage portal. The IP address matches your sister's residence. She downloaded and edited documents weeks before the trip. Grace had been building the paperwork long before we packed the SUV. They had also subpoenaed vehicle data from Grace's SUV. The GPS logs showed something that made my hands go cold. 2 hours after leaving the campsite, the vehicle had returned to the forest access road and remained there for 12 minutes. She went back, I said. Yes, Alvarez confirmed. No emergency call placed from that location. They hadn't panicked and fled. They had checked. Monroe opened another folder. We also pulled casino records. Your sister has over $400,000 in online gambling debt. Collection notices escalated 1 week before your trip. There it was. The missing motive now had numbers. 30 days to pay, 2 bodies in a remote forest, $50,000 each. Foreclosure paused by estate proceedings. Alvarez arranged a controlled call that afternoon. I sat in a neighboring room with a headset on while Grace answered from what sounded like her kitchen. "Martha?" she gasped theatrically when she heard my name. "Oh my God, where are you? We've been devastated." Alvarez's voice cut in smoothly. "We're reviewing the insurance claim you filed." A pause. "Well, we assumed the worst," Grace said. "We were just protecting the house from the bank. You know how foreclosure works." Protecting. I felt something inside me shift permanently. Later that evening, Alvarez informed me that arrest warrants were being prepared. Charges under consideration included attempted first-degree murder, insurance fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, and child endangerment. My parents had already been interviewed separately. My mother claimed she thought we would wander back to camp. My father admitted signing emergency estate documents, but insisted he believed I was emotionally unstable after Daniel's death. Alvarez played the recording for them. Neither of them denied Grace's voice. When I returned to Toby's hospital room, he was propped up in bed without the oxygen mask for the first time. His breathing was softer now, steadier. "Is Aunt Grace in trouble?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "For what?" "For making a very bad decision." He nodded thoughtfully and leaned back against his pillow. The next morning, Alvarez called. "She's been taken into custody," he said. "Your parents as well. No resistance." I stood by the window and watched early sunlight stretch across the parking lot below. They had believed paperwork would erase us, that signatures and deadlines and quiet filings would bury the truth. Instead, every document they rushed to submit became another line in the record of their guilt. The forest hadn't silenced us. It had preserved the evidence. The courthouse in Erie felt colder than the forest ever had. Cameras lined the steps outside, reporters murmuring into microphones about a family conspiracy in the wilderness. I walked past them without stopping. Toby stayed with a court-appointed child advocate in a quiet room upstairs. He would not sit in that courtroom and listen to strangers dissect his oxygen levels like a business transaction. Inside, the air smelled faintly of old wood and tension. Grace sat at the defense table in a navy suit, her hair perfectly smoothed, her posture composed. She looked less like a sister and more like a stranger who happened to share my DNA. My parents sat beside her. My mother dabbed her eyes with a tissue before anything had even begun. My father stared straight ahead, jaw tight. Assistant District Attorney Monroe rose first. She laid out the timeline clearly, methodically. Insurance policy purchased 3 months before the trip. Digital signature reused from prior refinance documents without authorization. Remote campsite selected by Grace. Asthma medication removed and discarded. Insurance claim filed on day 3 of our disappearance. Emergency estate petition filed on day 4. Vehicle GPS data showing the SUV returning to the forest access road 2 hours after they had driven away. No emergency call placed, no organized search requested. The courtroom fell silent as the timeline appeared on the screen, each date stacked neatly against the next. Then Monroe played the recording. Grace's voice filled the room. "Without the inhaler, he won't last 2 nights. The defense attorney stood immediately. "Objection. Context." The judge overruled him. Forensic audio specialists had already authenticated the recording. The timestamp aligned with the first night in the forest. Grace kept her eyes forward. When it was the defense's turn, her attorney painted me as unstable, grieving widow, financially overwhelmed, possibly suicidal. He suggested the family believed I might walk into the woods intentionally. They assumed medication was in her possession, he argued. There was no intent to harm. Monroe didn't raise her voice when she responded. She introduced pharmacy refill records showing that Grace personally picked up Toby's prescription the day before the trip. She introduced the torn medication bag fragment recovered after the flood. She introduced the casino debt records, the 30-day demand notice, the foreclosure acceleration letter. She introduced the GPS log that showed Grace returning to the forest and waiting. The narrative of confusion began to crumble. My mother took the stand and claimed she believed we would come back to camp later that day. My father admitted signing estate documents to protect property, insisting he never imagined harm. When Monroe asked him why no emergency call was placed after returning to the forest access road, he had no answer. He finally looked at me across the room. "We didn't think it would go this far," he said quietly. But they had. They had thought it through in spreadsheets and policy documents and deadlines. After 4 days of deliberation, the jury returned. The courtroom stood. Grace was found guilty of attempted first-degree murder, insurance fraud, and conspiracy to commit fraud. Sentence: life imprisonment without parole. My parents were found guilty of accessory charges and child endangerment, 15 years each. There was no shouting, no dramatic collapse. Grace's expression tightened only slightly as the sentence was read. My mother cried openly. My father closed his eyes. After the hearing, my father asked to speak to me privately in a small room off the hallway. "We're still family," he said, his voice breaking. I looked at him steadily. Family doesn't take a child's breath to pay a debt. There was nothing else to say. Outside the courthouse, the sun felt brighter than it had that morning. Reporters called my name, asking if I felt vindicated, if this was revenge. I didn't stop. This had never been about revenge. It had been about proving that what they tried to label an accident was a plan, and plans leave evidence. 3 months after the sentencing, I stood barefoot at the edge of the Atlantic and listened to my son laugh. The wind off the water was steady but gentle, nothing like the mountain air that had clawed at his lungs in the forest. Toby ran along the shoreline, chasing foam as it curled over his feet. He stopped once, bent forward out of habit, and then straightened again when he realized he didn't need to brace himself. He was breathing freely. We had sold the house in Pittsburgh 2 weeks earlier, not under pressure, not under foreclosure threat, on our terms. The mortgage was paid in full. The second lien cleared. The paperwork that had once felt like a noose became just another stack of documents signed and filed. I walked through the empty living room one last time before handing over the keys. The walls echoed without furniture, without memory attached to them. For a moment, I expected to feel something dramatic. Anger, grief, regret. Instead, I felt light. The house had almost become a grave marker. Now it was just real estate. Toby's pulmonologist confirmed what we already knew. His lungs were stable, stronger even. The doctor told me quietly that another 24 hours without intervention in the forest might have changed everything. I nodded and squeezed Toby's hand. That sentence stayed with me, but it no longer controlled me. One evening, sitting on the porch of our small rental near the coast, Toby asked, "Will we ever go camping again?" I didn't hesitate. "Yes," I said, "but we'll choose who we go with." He considered that carefully, then nodded. Trust, I had learned, is not inherited. It is built. And it can be withdrawn. The media coverage faded over time. At first, there were headlines about family betrayal and insurance fraud. Then there were opinion pieces debating loyalty and accountability. Some strangers online wrote that I should have handled it privately, that pressing charges against family was extreme. I stopped reading the comments. People are often more uncomfortable with a woman drawing a boundary than with the reason she draws it. I received one letter from my father in prison. It was brief. He asked for forgiveness. He wrote that he never meant for it to go so far. I folded the letter and placed it in a drawer without responding. Forgiveness is personal. Accountability is legal. They received one. They are not entitled to the other. Toby's stuffed bear sits on his new bed now. The tiny recorder still tucked inside. I keep it there not as a reminder of fear, but as proof that preparation is not paranoia when your instincts are whispering. Some nights I still hear the river rising in my dreams. I still see the dagger pinned into the picnic table, but those images don't define the ending. The ending is this. A child who almost ran out of air now races up sand dunes without stopping. A mother who was supposed to disappear now stands in open daylight without flinching. Survival wasn't about screaming or destroying anyone. It was about documenting truth, about refusing to let someone rewrite our disappearance as an accident. If you've ever been told to stay quiet because family is family, I want you to hear this clearly. Blood does not give anyone permission to gamble with your safety. If this story meant something to you, if it reminded you that strength can be quiet and still be powerful, tell me in the comments. Have you ever had to choose your own safety over loyalty? And if you believe stories about survival, justice, and taking your power back deserve to be heard, stay with me. Subscribe. There are more stories like this waiting to be told, because sometimes the greatest revenge isn't destroying the people who tried to erase you. It's walking away, breathing. This narrative is dramatized for storytelling impact.